In 2004, two Stanford dropouts sold shares in their company to the public for the first time. They kept 10 votes for every one vote they sold to outside investors. That single decision is why, more than 20 years later, that company's founders still shape its fate. This is not a loophole. It is engineered, disclosed, and completely legal. And it is the reason some founders can sell 80% of their company and still run it like they own all of it. If you are building toward a raise, a secondary sale, or a private equity buyout, this is the conversation your bankers will not walk you through in detail. Not because it's secret, because most of them assume you already know it, or they're not incentivized to slow the deal down long enough to explain it. We are going to open up the actual mechanisms: dual-class shares, golden shares, and voting trusts. Every claim in this video is sourced from SEC filings, court records, stock exchange disclosures, or reporting from Reuters, Bloomberg, Forbes, and Harvard Law School's Corporate Governance Forum. Nothing here is speculation, and nothing here is a workaround for laws meant to protect investors. These are structures regulators know about and permit, within limits we'll cover. One note before we start: this video is educational, not legal or financial advice. Every one of these structures needs a securities lawyer who knows your jurisdiction. Let's start with the idea most founders get wrong before their first real fundraise. Ownership and control are not the same thing. Ownership is your percentage of the economic pie, what you get if the company is sold or pays dividends. Control is your percentage of the votes that decide who sits on the board, who becomes CEO, and whether the company gets sold at all. In a normal company, those two numbers are identical: one share, one vote, one slice of the profit. But founders who understand corporate architecture design their company so those two numbers separate early, often years before any outside investor shows up. The moment they separate, a founder can sell down their economic stake, even below 20%, while their voting power barely moves. That gap between economic ownership and voting power is the entire game. There are three main tools used to create that gap: dual-class shares, golden shares, and voting trusts. Each one does the same job through a different legal mechanism, and each one fits a different situation: a public listing, a strategic sale, or a multi-generational family business. We'll take them one at a time with real companies, real numbers, and the paper trail behind each one. Mechanism 1, dual-class shares. The structure is simple on paper. You create two classes of common stock. One class, usually sold to the public, carries one vote per share. The other class, held by founders, carries multiple votes per share, often 10. When one major search engine company filed to go public in 2004, its founders told investors directly, in the prospectus itself, that this structure was designed to make it harder for outside parties to take over or influence the company. Class A shares sold to the public got one vote each. Class B shares held by insiders got 10 votes each. According to a review of exchange data by Harvard Business Services, roughly 1 in 5 U.S. stock listings between 2009 and 2017 used some version of a dual-class structure. A major social media company used the same tool at its 2012 IPO, and by the time reporters and governance researchers reviewed its founder's position years later, he controlled close to 60% of the company's voting power through supervoting shares. A photo-sharing app company pushed the structure to its logical extreme when it listed in 2017. The shares sold to the public carried 0 votes, not fewer votes, 0. That company's own annual report the following year disclosed that its co-founders controlled 97% of total voting power. Investors could buy the stock, share in the profit if it rose, and have no say whatsoever in who ran the company. This is not unique to big tech. Reuters reported in 2026 that several major technology and holding companies currently operate with 2 or more share classes. And when a private rocket company filed for its own share sale, the same dual-class design was used to keep its founders' control intact, regardless of how much equity gets sold down the line. Here's the part most founders miss. Dual-class structures aren't only for tech IPOs. A major American automaker has used this exact tool since going public in 1956. And it's a useful example because it shows what happens decades later. The founding family set up the two-class system in the 1930s as part of estate planning, retaining a class of voting stock even as most of the economic shares moved into a charitable foundation. According to the company's own SEC filings, the founding family today owns less than 2% of total equity. Yet through Class B shares carrying roughly 37 votes each, the family still controls 40% of total voting power, enough combined with how board elections work to keep effective control of the company. That 40% figure isn't an accident. The company's charter is written so the formula recalculates to hold Class B voting power at 40% as long as a minimum share count remains outstanding. Read that again. 2% ownership, 40% control, disclosed in public filings for nearly 70 years. That is corporate control engineering, operating in plain sight the entire time. Dual-class structures can also blow up, and one office space startup's collapse is the clearest warning available. When that company filed to go public in 2019, its S-1 filing revealed that its co-founders' shares carried 20 votes each, versus 1 vote for public shareholders. That structure alone would have handed him majority control of the company for the rest of his life, according to the filing's own voting arrangement disclosures. When the terms leaked, investors and journalists reacted so badly that the company was forced to cut those super voting shares from 20 votes down to 10, according to Fortune's reporting on the amended filing. It didn't matter. The IPO collapsed anyway, and the founder stepped down as CEO within weeks. The Council of Institutional Investors, which represents pension funds managing trillions of dollars, called the episode proof that concentrated voting power without limits creates exactly the governance risk investors fear most. The lesson isn't never use dual-class shares. Decades of use elsewhere prove they can work. The lesson is that the market, and increasingly the institutions writing the biggest checks, now expect these structures to come with limits. That's where sunset clauses come in. Provisions that automatically convert super voting shares into ordinary shares after a set number of years, or when a founder leaves the company. The Council of Institutional Investors has pushed exchanges to require a 7-year sunset on new dual-class listings. And by 2021, roughly half of newly public dual-class companies had adopted one, per CII's own tracking. Some legal scholars, including Bernard Scharfman, writing in the Southern California Law Review, argue mandatory sunsets go too far and interfere with terms founders and early investors freely agreed to. Either way, if you're negotiating a dual-class structure today, expect institutional buyers to ask about your sunset terms before they ask about almost anything else. That single clause, sunset or no sunset, is often the difference between a smooth secondary sale and a stalled one. Mechanism 2, the golden share. A golden share is different from dual-class stock in one important way. It doesn't need to represent much equity at all. Sometimes it's a single share, worth as little as £1, that carries the power to veto specific named decisions, regardless of who owns the rest of the company. The concept was born in the United Kingdom during the 1980s privatization wave under Margaret Thatcher's government. The government wanted to sell state-owned companies to private investors, but it didn't want to lose all say over decisions that touched national security. So it kept a single golden share in companies like a major aerospace manufacturer and a leading jet engine maker, giving it veto power over any takeover it disapproved of. That golden share is still active today. As recently as 2022, analysts noted that any foreign takeover bid for that jet engine maker would almost certainly be blocked by the UK government's retained veto right. A major defense contractor operates under the same arrangement, a single government-held share worth roughly £1 that blocks constitutional changes without government consent, per the company's own disclosures. The mechanism isn't only historical either. In 2025, a foreign company's acquisition of a major American steelmaker was structured with a golden share arrangement, giving the sitting U.S. president extensive ongoing control over specific decisions, as reported by Reuters and others. The United Steelworkers Union publicly described that arrangement as an unusual concentration of personal power over a private corporation. Golden shares aren't only a government tool, though that's their most famous use. Corporate law resources describe the same structure used privately. A founder or partner holding a share worth almost nothing economically, but carrying a contractual veto over a defined list. Mergers, asset sales, or changes to the company's mission. The mechanic that matters for founders isn't the size of the stake, it's the specificity of what gets vetoed. A golden share that says the holder can block any sale of the company is powerful and narrow. A golden share that tries to block everything tends to scare off investors because it starts to look less like protection and more like control theater. This is the version of the tool most relevant to a Series B+ founder heading into a private equity minority buyout. According to a 2026 briefing note from law firm Bryan Cave Leighton Paisner, even in minority PE deals where the founder keeps board control, investors will still negotiate reserved matters, decisions requiring their sign-off regardless of board majority. The negotiation that actually matters in these deals isn't, will I keep control? Founders in minority PE deals usually do. It's, how long is the reserved matters list and how low are the thresholds that trigger it? A well-negotiated founder position flips that list. The founder holds a narrow name veto over the few decisions that actually matter: a full sale, a change in core mission, or removal of the founding CEO. That's a private, contractual version of the golden share. No government, no press headlines, just a clause in a shareholders' agreement most junior associates drafting the deal will never explain to you in plain language. There's a fourth variant worth knowing, even though it's technically a hybrid of the tools above. The partnership structure one major Chinese e-commerce company used for its 2014 listing. By the time of the IPO, according to the company's own SEC filing, its founder held just 8.9% of the company's economic shares, far less than its major institutional backers. But the company's charter gave a group of roughly 27 senior insiders the exclusive right to nominate a majority of the board of directors, regardless of who owned the most shares. Hong Kong's stock exchange refused to approve a structure that let a minority group control board nominations that way, which is the specific reason the company chose to list in New York instead, a decision widely reported at the time. American exchanges allow this because U.S. securities law doesn't require one share, one vote the way some other markets do, a regulatory gap that has shaped where the biggest tech listings in the world actually happen. The IPO filing went further. Two major shareholders separately agreed to hand the founders a proxy over large blocks of their own shares, so even outside investors effectively voted the way the founders directed. That's board control layered on top of proxy agreements, layered on top of a minority equity stake. Three separate mechanisms stacked on each other, all disclosed in the same prospectus. Governance researchers in the Harvard Law School Forum call this synthetic control, power assembled from several smaller legal tools rather than one dominant share class. The lesson for a founder isn't copy this exact structure. Offshore partnership agreements combined with board nomination rights are complex and expensive to build. The lesson is that these mechanisms aren't mutually exclusive. Sophisticated founders combine more than one, the way this company stacked board nomination rights with proxy agreements toward one outcome: control that survives dilution. Mechanism 3, the voting trust. This is the oldest of the three tools, and in some ways the simplest to understand. A voting trust is a legal arrangement where shareholders transfer the voting rights of their shares, not the economic ownership, to a trustee who is bound to vote them in a specific agreed way. The shareholders still receive dividends and still benefit if the shares increase in value. They simply no longer vote those shares individually. That American automaker we discussed earlier uses exactly this structure, layered on top of its dual-class shares. According to the company's own SEC exhibits, tens of millions of Class B shares are held inside a voting trust, and the trustees are required to vote every one of those shares as directed by whichever position holds a plurality of the trust participants. In practice, that means the extended founding family, dozens of descendants, many with small individual stakes, votes as one unified block because the trust forces alignment rather than allowing fragmentation. This solves a problem dual-class shares alone don't solve. What happens when the founder's voting stock gets split across children, grandchildren, and cousins over decades? Without a trust, that voting power fragments with every generation, and eventually a family that once controlled a company can lose that control simply through inheritance and disagreement. A voting trust prevents that by legally requiring the family's votes to move together, decided by majority vote inside the trust itself, no matter how many individual descendants technically hold shares. This is the structure most relevant to second-generation family businesses, the founder's children who inherited equity but are being pressured by siblings to sell or to change direction. A properly drafted voting trust, agreed to before that pressure arrives, means no single sibling and no external buyer courting one sibling privately can pick off enough shares to force a vote their way. It converts what would otherwise become a family conflict, fought share by share, into a single governed block with agreed decision rules. It is, in effect, a written constitution for how the family disagrees, decided while everyone is still getting along. Now let's look outside the United States, because these tools don't stop at American borders. They exist, in modified form, in India too. India's version is called Differential Voting Rights Shares, or DVRs, introduced through an amendment to the Companies Act back in 2000. One of India's largest automakers became the first Indian company to actually use them, issuing DVR shares in 2008 that carried only 1/10 the voting power of an ordinary share, in exchange for a 5% higher dividend. That's the trade at the heart of the Indian version. Public investors are offered better economic returns in exchange for giving up most of their voting say, the mirror image of the U.S. dual-class model. For years, Indian regulator SEBI actually banned the reverse version, shares with superior voting rights for founders, worried they'd be used to entrench family management at the expense of minority shareholders. That changed in 2019 when SEBI approved a new framework specifically allowing founders of new economy technology companies to issue superior voting shares, capped so founder voting power cannot exceed 74% of the total. The framework also built in a mandatory sunset. Those superior voting shares must convert to ordinary shares within 5 years of listing, a tighter window than the 7 years American governance groups typically push for. According to India's Association of Corporate Counsel, this framework exists specifically so asset-light tech founders who rely on repeated equity rounds rather than debt don't lose control simply because they need capital. It's a direct, government-endorsed acknowledgement of the exact problem this video is about: raising money by selling equity forces. Dilution unless you deliberately engineer around it. For Indian founders sitting on Series B+ valuations and eyeing a similar raise, the SEBI framework means the tool is legally available, but with real limits your investors will already know about, so there's no advantage in pretending you don't. Now to the market with the least public conversation about any of this: Pakistan. Pakistan doesn't have a DVR-style regulatory framework the way India does, and its Securities and Exchange Commission focuses more on takeover disclosure rules than on differential voting products. That doesn't mean control engineering isn't happening. It means it happens privately, inside shareholders' agreements and family constitutions, largely outside public view. The research is blunt about why this matters. According to the Center for International Private Enterprise, only around 15% of family-owned businesses survive into their third generation, and of those, the large majority don't make it to a fourth. The most commonly cited cause isn't bad products or bad markets. It's the absence of a succession plan and unmanaged conflict once ownership starts splitting among siblings and cousins. One of Pakistan's most recognized food companies is cited by governance researchers as a rare success story, precisely because its second generation formalized governance early instead of letting informal family control collapse under its own weight. For a second-generation owner in Lahore or Karachi being pressured by siblings to sell, the tools are the same ones we've covered. They just need a lawyer to draft them privately, since no regulator hands you a template. A voting trust binding the siblings' votes together, a founder-held veto over the decisions that matter most, or a holding company that keeps shares under the founding generation's control. All legal under standard Pakistani company law, simply never marketed the way Silicon Valley structures are. So here is the practical question. If you're a founder heading into a Series B+ raise, a secondary sale, or a minority PE buyout, how do you actually use any of this? First, sequence matters. Dual-class structures are dramatically easier to set up before your first institutional round than after. Retrofitting dual-class stock onto a company that already has multiple investor classes usually requires unanimous or near-unanimous shareholder consent, which later investors have little incentive to give away for free. If you're early enough to still have that option, the conversation with your lawyer should happen before your Series A term sheet is signed, not after. Second, if dual class is off the table because you're already past that point, look at reserved matters negotiation instead. That's the golden share style tool available in almost any minority investment, at any stage. The BCLP note is explicit about this. Reserved matters are standard in every PE deal, so the real question is how narrow you can negotiate the list and how high you can push the thresholds that trigger it. Third, if ownership is fragmenting across co-founders or family members, a voting trust solves what neither dual-class shares nor reserved matters can: the risk that your own side splits and votes against itself. Fourth, and this is the part most founders skip, put a sunset clause in voluntarily before an investor or a proxy advisor demands one. CII's own data shows time-based sunsets are now the norm at IPO, not the exception, and offering one preemptively signals to institutional buyers that you understand the governance conversation instead of resisting it. Fifth, get the mechanism written into your cap table and your shareholders' agreement, not just discussed verbally. Every example in this video exists because it was filed, disclosed, and legally enforceable, not because someone promised it in a meeting. Quick aside on why this conversation rarely happens the way it should, in the room where it actually matters. Investment bankers running your process are paid on the size and speed of the deal closing, not on how much long-term control you retain afterward. Deal lawyers representing the company are working from your term sheet, and if you don't ask for a reserved matters carve-out or a dual-class conversion clause, most won't volunteer the extra negotiation time unprompted. None of this is malicious. It's simply misaligned incentives and understanding that is part of protecting yourself in the room. Investors on the other side of the table negotiate control provisions every week. Their lawyers have templates, their term sheets have standard reserved matters lists, and their partners have done this dozens of times. You as a founder are usually doing this for the first time in the most important transaction of your professional life against a counterparty that does it for a living. That asymmetry is exactly why these mechanisms stay hidden in plain sight. Not because they're secret, but because only one side of the table is incentivized to bring them up first. Knowing the vocabulary, dual class, golden share, voting trust, sunset clause, reserved matters, is what lets you bring it up first instead. Now, the honest counter-argument, because a video like this owes you the other side. Not everyone thinks founders should be able to do this. Institutional investor groups managing trillions in combined assets, including the Council of Institutional Investors, have formally opposed unlimited dual-class structures, arguing voting power should track economic risk, the classic one share, one vote principle. Academic research is genuinely split. A 2023 Harvard Law School piece on dual-class stock notes that European researchers found the valuation premium often shrinks, sometimes into a discount, roughly 7 to 9 years after IPO. In plain terms, the market doesn't give founders unlimited benefit of the doubt forever. The longer a company keeps outsized founder control without a clear reason, the more some investors start pricing in the risk of unaccountable leadership. Golden shares carry the same tension. The European Court of Justice has repeatedly struck down overly broad government golden shares, including the UK's and Portugal's, for violating free movement of capital rules. The takeaway: narrow, disclosed, time-limited versions survive scrutiny. Broad, permanent, undisclosed ones eventually get challenged by courts, investors, or your own future co-investors. Design these structures like you expect someone smart to eventually push back on them, because eventually someone will. Here's the through line. A 2004 tech IPO, an automaker structure since 1956, a partnership model since 2014, an Indian DVR framework since 2008, and the reserved matters clauses being negotiated in PE deals this year. None of these founders avoided giving up equity. All of them gave up a lot of it. One founding family sold down to under 2% ownership and never lost the boardroom. What they didn't give up, because they engineered it deliberately, was the vote. That is the actual mechanism behind selling 80% and still running the company. It was never about hiding money or dodging investors. It's about understanding, before the term sheet is signed, that ownership and control are two separate variables, and only one of them has to shrink when you raise capital. If you're heading into a Series B+ raise, a secondary sale, or a family succession conversation and want to talk through which structure fits your cap table, message me directly on Signal. My username is thebusinessarchitect123.43. That's the business architect 123.43. I read every message myself, and I'd rather talk through your actual situation privately than have you guess at it from a YouTube comment section. If this video mapped out a mechanism you hadn't seen laid out this clearly before, subscribe to The Business Architect. We go one level deeper into hidden money and power structures every single week. I'll see you in the next one.